think you could hear.
Welcome to No to NATO, No to War. We are an intercontinental weapon for peace and against war, especially against the imperialist wars launched by NATO and by NATO countries all around the world over this last 30 years and more. And tonight we are going intercontinental. Talk about time zones. One of our speakers has not even been to bed yet, and it's 7 o'clock in the morning where he is. I am, contrary to the suggestion of the logo behind me, just back from the BRICS. BRICS began its life only as an economic and, to some extent, fiscal weapon of the global south, of the global east. As the name suggests, it was originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Britain will be the last letter in that acronym, I'm sure. But it has grown and grown, not just numerically, but grown in its purview, in its grasp of international events, in its importance to the world. In the beginning, for a decade, actually, the international media ignored its very existence, but increasingly they can ignore it no longer. I was there with my good wife Gayatri in Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan, a Muslim republic within the Russian Federation, and an absolute jewel indeed. A beautiful city with a citadel, a Kremlin, with mosques by the dozen, and with a friendly local population that stoically put up with the arrival of no less than 36 presidents, prime ministers, princes, and kings, 20,000 delegates, 2,000 journalists, most of them decent journalists, one or two of them rather obscene, but we'll come, no doubt, to that. The local people in Kazan gave a hearty welcome to each and every one of us. It was, I can only put it this way, like being present at the birth of a beloved child. It was the new world being delivered. Now, we're all familiar with the Gramscian quote that the new world is struggling to be born, the old world is dying, and that we live in the time of monsters. All of these three things are true. But to be at the birth, to see, for a start, BRICS become double I, with Iran's full membership confirmed at the summit, with the arrival of princes and kings of Arabia, people that were long regarded as Western satraps who could never have been imagined to be in Russia, walking around with President Vladimir Putin, with President Xi Jinping, and with the other leaders of the BRICS. It was astonishing to see so many British Commonwealth government leaders there and heads of state, not least because they turned down the chance to be with King Charles himself at a British Commonwealth event, preferring to be with Vladimir Putin in Russia. Just shows how isolated Russia is not. Now, for the first few days of the summit, the Western press pretended that it wasn't happening. But as it got bigger and bigger and the new acquisitions became more and more significant, Turkey, for example, a NATO member, now in BRICS, and speculation mounted that it will not be long before the first European Union and NATO member will join the BRICS. The Western media turned up the heat. The London Times called BRICS a grotesque summit. The Bild in Germany called BRICS a summit of scoundrels. And you could see scurrying like rats the British journalists from Sky News and from BBC scurrying around the conference, seeking to cause problems, seeking to embarrass people about their presence in Kazan in Russia for the BRICS. And I had myself a now celebrated encounter with a youth, a 38-year-old youth, an Oxford University educated 38-year-old youth, but he might as well have been 16 with a pencil. He was a teenage scribbler who knew nothing about BRICS and cared even less about it. His purpose there was to go up to people with the microphone and ask them how they felt about being in Russia when Russia was committing all these crimes all over the world. But the BBC presence was even more pernicious. The BBC correspondent has been 30 years in Moscow, 30 years against Moscow. His purpose for the BBC, the British state mouthpiece BBC, is to do everything, anything that he can to disrupt anything positive happening in Russia, to lie for his master's voice that Russia is some kind of hellhole, some kind of authoritarian tyranny. And as I pointed out in the presence of President Vladimir Putin himself, it's a strange kind of tyranny where the BBC can bristle with hostility against the Russian president just 20 meters from him, whilst no Russian journalist or broadcaster is permitted to work at all in Britain, never mind at Westminster or Whitehall, never mind 20 meters away from the British Prime Minister. So the length of the faces of the Western governments and their media mouthpieces is the first indicator of the success of BRICS 2024, and indeed of Russia's chairmanship of the process throughout. The setting up of commodity exchanges, in the first place, a grain commodity exchange, so that BRICS members, now bear in mind, half of the world is now in BRICS. Half the world's population is now in BRICS. And if you add the countries in the waiting room, that number will be dwarfed by the time we get to Rio de Janeiro 2025 for the next BRICS event, the next BRICS summit. Half the world is now going to be able to exchange commodities completely separate from the Western-dominated commodities exchanges, which drive down prices for producers, drive up profits for the middlemen and for the retailers. The BRICS countries will now be able to bypass them completely and exchange their commodities with each other in local currencies. In local currencies. Think what that means. Half of the world, when it comes to commodities, are going to be able to avoid the dollar completely. And given that US domination of the world is now resting on just two stools, one of them, the dollar hegemony, caused after 1973 by the US demand and ironclad insistence that all oil trading needs to be done in dollars, and the other stool being America's military industrial prowess, its military industrial complex, and they're not doing too well on that either. These are two rickety stools on which US hegemony now rests. But there will be other commodity exchanges along in a minute. The predominantly important one being the mineral exchange. Russia, as most intelligent people know, is the largest repository of mineral deposits anywhere in the world. Russia is replete with oil, with gas, with nickel, with every kind of rare earth commodity, without which planes can't fly, cars can't drive, phones can't work. Russia's riches in the mineral and commodities fields almost literally no bounds. And when it comes to the need for these raw materials, these commodities, these minerals, then markets like China, like India, which are booming markets, are going to be able to exchange their local currencies for those commodities in these now free BRICS exchanges. There were one or two hiccups at the BRICS Congress. For me, the most significant was the absence of the Brazilian President Lula, a man I knew when he was an itinerant trade union leader back in the mid-1980s. Some of you know I lent him $200 US. He hasn't paid me back yet. I was looking forward to meeting him at Kazan. I gave him $200 US because he literally had no money with which to continue his tour around Europe, struggling against the tyranny, the dictatorship in Brazil. But Lula couldn't come. He had an accident, genuinely, I believe, though most people in Kazan thought it was a diplomatic accident. I never did. And I've since seen a picture of the wound on Lula's head caused by a fall in his bathroom. It's a little bit unsteady on the legs now, and he's not getting any younger, and he was unable to come. But worse than that, in his absence, he delivered his vetoes against Venezuela and Nicaragua coming into the BRICS process. And this was particularly galling for Venezuela, as they had already paid their $500 million deposit on the basis that they were to be admitted. This has caused tremendous trouble in Latin America. It has caused the withdrawal of ministers and ambassadors, has caused diplomatic and political problems in Latin America in general. And this is particularly significant because Brazil is the new chair of the BRICS from the end of the year. So some anxiety must be permitted about how much progress BRICS will make under the presidency of Brazil, given that it's very clear that Brazil has some difficulties with other partners, other potential partners that are regarded as important by the principals, Russia and China. The tension between growth and direction is an obvious one. The more people you've got in a room, the more difficult it is to move everybody forward in the same direction, especially as, unlike other international fora, the BRICS is a free space and a consensual one. You cannot make decisions, certainly not big, important decisions, without reaching a consensus amongst the members. And the more members BRICS has, the more difficult that is potentially going to be. But nonetheless, the steady stream of leaders from all over the world, from all parts of the world. I mean, it was at times, like, for those familiar with this history, it was a bit like the Congress of the Peoples in Baku in, I think, 1920, where John Reed, the American journalist, author of 10 Days That Shook the World, he described in such vivid detail the arrival of delegations in their national dress with their national peculiarities, arriving and getting down under one roof to discuss the future of humanity. It had something of that about it, and it was a joy to behold. It was an honor to be there. So I'm going to now introduce the first of our speakers, because we do like to wrap these No to NATO, No to War meetings up in an hour or an hour and five or so. So let me press on to the first of our guests. He is nothing less than a youthful internet sensation. I like to think I've known Richard Medhurst since he was a boy. He's now a man of significance. He's now a man of considerable importance, both because of the quality of his work and also because the British state has begun to try and make a martyr out of him. But he will confound them, and he deserves the support of all of us. He is, of course, Richard Medhurst. Richard, the floor is yours. What do you think about BRICS? What do you think about the international situation post-BRICS?
Hi, George. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate the grand introduction. It was, if I could just start by saying, I very much appreciated your interaction with the British press in the hallways, which you were referring to. It was quite amusing to watch. It seemed like they turned up to cause trouble and just kind of ended up digging a hole for themselves. So that was kind of funny. Yeah. Honestly, I think the moment that we're in right now is really, we can trace it back to when the war in Ukraine started. I've always said that was the catalyst for what's going on, and I know we've all been, our attention is rightfully been turned towards Gaza because of just how horrific the slaughter is on a scale we haven't seen since in decades. Probably haven't seen since World War II, but the Ukraine war is really the catalyst where we start seeing this acceleration of Western dominance, particularly US hegemony, starting to crumble. And it was really just remarkable, I think, not just watching the United States begin to lose that much power so quickly, but also watching Europe shoot itself in the foot. We shouldn't forget that Joe Biden, the Nord Stream bomber, which is a great nickname that I've heard and I'm going to use, literally carried out an act of industrial terrorism. He blew up an enormous pipeline between Germany and Russia, two pipelines. And I think people need to understand how significant that is. It's not just a question of, well, there's no more gas coming in. One of the main policies after World War II for, to avoid having further world wars was that you would promote economic growth between neighbors, which is exactly what you see with BRICS, with Russia and China, for example, and India, right? So there's this underlying premise that we are neighbors and we should get along and we should work in each other's favor. So that was something that was promoted across Europe, and that's the reason why you had so much cheap gas flowing from Russia to Germany. And then the United States just blows that up, and everyone pretends like they didn't see it happen. To me, this is remarkable, and I think it's worth pointing out, as Joe Biden is about to leave office in a few days, it's looking like, and we're having the BRICS summit, take place. It's not a coincidence that you have 20, 30 countries trying to join BRICS at this moment in time after the war in Ukraine began. And of course, this wave of sanctions spilled over. And once again, we see Europe shooting itself in the foot. You've got steel industry in Germany, glass industry in France. I mean, you can go through every single European country and just see how energy prices have gone up. And that's caused entire industries to shut down. And now Germany's in recession, for example. It's unbelievable how much damage Europe has done to itself as a result. And while that is happening, BRICS is taking the lead with things. I think people forget that, if you look at the United States, you look at how much forecast they have in their GDP growth. It's about, 2.4, 2.8%. That's the rough estimate for the last quarter, because it's not over yet. And you start to look at China. China is around 4.8%, and that's low for China, right? So this era of Western domination is completely gone. It's over, and people are in a phase of denial. That's the only thing we can really call it. It is denial. I believe Richard Wolff, Professor Richard Wolff, was doing a video on this, and before it came out of his mouth, I knew that's the word he was going to use. It is denial. That's where we are at now in the West. We're in denial about our crimes in Gaza, and we're in denial about the recession of the West and the rise of BRICS. And I think it was important to see all these leaders going there, because it showed that Putin is not isolated. There's this trend of Russian sanctions are going to destroy Russia. They didn't. Russia, by the way, I think that their forecast for this year, for the last quarter, is going to be about 3.8% 8% of GDP growth. So that's more than the United States. So much for sanctions. And of course, the ruble was the best performing currency last year. But the economy aside and the figures aside, just that photograph of seeing Putin, and to the left and to the right, he's got Modi and Xi Jinping and all of these leaders that have come now, that, except Lula, as you alluded to, and I think MBS also wasn't there. But we had most of the BRICS leaders there. It shows he's not isolated. Okay, the fact that 20, 30 countries want to join and try and get through the door shows they're not isolated. This is the first BRICS summit that we've had, in Russia since the war in Ukraine began. All of the economic policies have failed. All of the political goals have failed. And Trump is now trying to make threats that, he'll put 100% tariffs on people that are trying to abandon the dollar. I mean, this is like a beast kind of just thrashing about, in its last moments. And it's it just looks pathetic. It's really just a bad look and a sad look. And we saw India and China also, they've struck a deal to, fix their issues on the border. So that's also good. And I suppose the best way to kind of encapsulate the BRICS summit would be to watch that clip of Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary in the United States, being asked what the future of the dollar looks like, and in the most ominous manner imaginable, as the question is departing the reporter's mouth, the seal of the Treasury falls on the ground, and it's just you couldn't write a better script, honestly. So that really that was really just a perfect encapsulation of where things are at right now.
Well, the BRICS is now bigger than the G7, the so-called giant 7 economies in the world, though that was always a misnomer. It's bigger than the G7 already. In numerical terms, it will shortly, in fact, if you add the partner members, it already is bigger than the G20. Half the world's population is already in the BRICS. Half the world's wealth is in the BRICS. And you're right that MBS did not make it, but he sent the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia with him. The president of the UAE was there, and there was a very interesting picture of him having a side meeting with the president of Iran, and appearing to hang on every word that the president of Iran was saying. The China-India rapprochement that you mentioned. I saw a picture today of Indian and Chinese border guards in the hotly disputed territory that their border constitutes in the Himalayas, exchanging gifts, where once they were exchanging rocks and once they were exchanging shot and shell. So we begin to see, don't we, Richard, the possibility of the BRICS being a kind of alternative United Nations. And heaven knows the United Nations is in a parlous condition right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it certainly has the capacity to unite people in that manner, and it's very clear. It goes without saying, in a sense, they don't have to flash it around with a neon sign. But the whole premise of this get together, it does have that ambiance and spirit of what the United Nations is meant to be, or what most people picture the United Nations of being. So yeah, obviously, I don't think it would take on necessarily the same form, but it definitely has that spirit, and I think we there's a lot to be learned from that. There's you look at the United States and Europe, and the relationship is not one of cooperation; it's more of subservience to Washington. So you don't see that at all when it comes to Russia and China and India. And I mean, you look at their landmass and their population. I mean, these are enormous players, right? They could easily have a go at each other if they wanted to, and they're not choosing to do that. So what does that really say about us? I think there's a philosophical lesson in there somewhere, which I haven't quite figured out just yet. But it certainly says that it leaves a lot to be desired, and there's a lot to learn there. I was also, I mean, just looking at the photographs and the videos of the event, and I have to say, George, I'm quite envious that you were able to attend, but at the same time, very happy that you were. I for one split second I actually thought it was the UN. The first time I saw any of the footage before realizing what it was, and yeah, so it definitely has that atmosphere and that feeling, and I think that it's a bit disappointing with Venezuela, for example, that they refused to admit Venezuela, and Brazil vetoed it and so on. Maduro, I mean, he delivered a good speech, and said a lot of good things about Gaza as well. So that was a bit disappointing to see them being rejected. But I'm interested. I'm keen to see what happens next with with for example Iran and the UAE. Of course, this relates to Gaza more than it does to BRICS, but nevertheless, it is interesting watching Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE kind of cooperate under the same roof, and that is in effect the spirit of the UN, if you will, or what it was supposed to be.
What it was supposed to be. Just to underscore your point about the philosophical point that you just made there, I made a video for Chinese television at the end of the BRICS for CGTN, which they have put out. But they have excised, they have removed any words of praise that I made towards China in the video. They completely removed my observation that China was the most important player, most important participant in the BRICS, and that Russia and China were the top dogs. All of that was removed from my video. Now, doesn't that tell you something about the determination on the part of these top players at BRICS to make it as collegiate and as far away from the spirit of domination, hegemony that attends G7 and G20 gatherings, for example?
Yeah, it does, and I think it's rather diplomatic. It's very Chinese in a way to do that. They are excellent at diplomacy. They have their own style, and I think it's quite interesting. Actually, I didn't know that they did that. It's like I said, it's quite refreshing in a way, isn't it? I once again I can't help but trace back everything that we're talking about to Ukraine, because that also was the result of this the US pushing Europe, pushing Ukraine into a proxy war against Russia, and look, it's just blown up in their faces, and they have accelerated. They've put the entire process of multipolarization or the transition to a multipolar world in turbo mode. They really have, and then Gaza, of course, added to that. But I think that they really shot themselves in the foot. They just can't grasp where things are at right now, and I suppose that's what every falling empire or receding empire does in its final days.
Well, I called it, Richard, thank you very much for that. I called it a deadly boomerang, which the West had fashioned and thrown it at Russia, only for it to come back and smash us in our own faces. I actually used those very words in the first week or 10 days of these sanctions. It's amazing that an undereducated boy from a council house like me was able to see that, but all the brain boxes in the Western governments were not. Thank you, Richard. Speaking of boomerangs, let's go down under, where, of course, the boomerang comes from. Aussie Cossack is one of our favorite people. He's so good, they're seeking to ban him here, there, and everywhere, but he'll never be banned from our portals. Aussie Cossack, welcome to No2Nato, No to War. Let's begin just in parenthesis with the latest crime against free speech with relation to yourself. You were quite some time ago taken off YouTube. Now you're not on Twitter. Say a word or two about that, will you please?
Thank you, George. Pleasure to join you, and pleasure to be with all of your viewers. Look, I was taken off YouTube in 2022 for medical misinformation. Nice platform, about 170,000 subscribers, and it was quite difficult to overcome that. Anyway, we all had hopes in Elon Musk, and I, as many others, joined the liberated X, formerly Twitter, to take advantage of the free speech. And unfortunately, just a few days ago, my platform on Twitter was banned without any reason given at all. But we do know that the Australian government and the Australian E-Safety Commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, and the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, were very, very keen to silence those voices of influence in the country who challenged the mainstream media narrative, challenged the government narrative, and let's just face it, make memes against the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is afraid of people sharing memes, making fun of him, laughing at him, organizing protests on the streets, promoting anti-government sentiment, whether it be against what happened, the government's response to the lockdowns and the COVID situation, or whether it's on a range of other issues, such as Australia's involvement against Russia and Ukraine. Australia foolishly committed all of its missiles, all of its Bushmasters. Now Australia's given 49 of its Abrams tanks, and that's the whole reserve of all of its Abrams tanks. Australia doesn't have any more tanks. They've got new ones on the way, supposed replacements. But those 49 which they have now sent, or in the process of sending, and we probably will start protesting at ports where these departure points of these tanks will be put onto container ships. Maybe we can get a bit of advice from the Great British Workers' Party and the union movements of how best to prevent these tanks from actually boarding these container ships, because Australia should not be sending its tanks joining NATO's war in Ukraine. The United States only sent 31 Abrams tanks. And out of those 31 Abrams tanks, about 20 have already been destroyed. And it's very embarrassing for the United States when there is video footage of Abrams tanks being destroyed by Russian forces. And the Abrams tanks which the Australian Army has are in far worse condition, because they're second-hand tanks that were originally from Iraq and then passed on as hand-me-downs to the Australians, who never used them in combat and had actually put them away into storage to retire them. So we are fiercely opposed to that in Australia. China would be watching this and laughing. Of course, even 49 tanks in Australia would not be any match for the Chinese military in the event of a conflict in the Pacific. But at least on paper, it looks formidable that Australia has 49 tanks. Well, now it doesn't have those tanks. It doesn't have the missiles. The Australian government just this week has announced that it's going on a spending spree, spending billions and billions of taxpayer dollars in a frenzy, in a shopping frenzy, buying missiles, buying American missiles. But of course, they can't get the missiles because now there is a global missile shortage, especially interceptor missiles, to what's happening in Israel. The Iron Dome interception system is failing. In Ukraine, there's not enough Patriot batteries. There's not enough missiles because this war that is this NATO war, which is developing Ukraine, is at a World War II level. I mean, certainly if you look at the amount of tanks that have been destroyed, I mean, 10 to 15,000 tanks have been destroyed. So 49 tanks from Australia plus minus is nothing. But for Australia, 49 is everything. That's all Australia has. Unfortunately, the Australian government continues to behave as a lapdog of the United States. People in Australia are not happy about this. There is certainly very strong potential for coordinated global No2Nato rallies at Parliament buildings and government buildings all around the country in Australia. And of course, it would be great to have a joint venture with you, George, perhaps on the streets of London. We can have a global no to NATO, no to war protest after, of course, the November the 5th election results, seeing how November the 5th, the United States presidency, the new president, will react to Ukraine. Now, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has urged people not to get their hopes up. And he said that whatever administration there is, whether it's Trump or Kamala Harris, the American deep state will continue what they're doing in Ukraine, because it's actually very, very beneficial, isn't it, for NATO? All of these European countries, especially the former Soviet bloc countries, the Poland, East Germany. There's so many old Soviet planes and tanks that have all been now sent to Ukraine, and these are all being replaced by brand new gear. So the Ukraine war is a fantastic thing for the Western military industrial complex. They've hit the jackpot with the Ukraine war. These billions and billions of dollars that we hear about, it's not necessarily going to Ukraine. Please don't be under the illusion that this money is actually reaching Ukrainian people. It's clear that the West doesn't care about Ukrainian people. They exploit Ukrainian women in the brothels of Europe. They exploit Ukrainian men by sending them into battle to die. They exploit Ukrainian children by trafficking them out of the country. And they exploit anyone in Ukraine for their organs. The waiting lists for organs all around Europe and the West in NATO countries have suddenly disappeared. If you need a kidney, you can get one straight away now. You need a heart, you need an eyeball, you need a liver. It's all available. You need a lung, you can take it, because Ukraine is providing, unfortunately, it's sad, it's terrible, disgusting to talk about this or imagine that a country's population is being so exploited. And that is the reason why Ukrainians actually see the Russian military, the Russian army, as liberators. The Russian army doesn't seek to exploit Ukrainian men. In fact, Ukrainian men are much safer in Russian liberated, or as the West would say, occupied territories. No one's arresting them. No one's mobilizing them. No one's sending Gestapo-like mobilization squads, thugs, and people are free to flourish. Russia's investing in the new regions. Crimea is booming. Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, there's peace. Russia is rebuilding these places because these lands, these territories are originally Russian. And now, because of NATO's insistence to escalate, to continue escalating this war, and of course, it started with what? Let's provide medipacks, let's provide bandages, let's provide non-lethal aid. Okay, let's provide bulletproof vests, let's provide boots, let's provide more and more. And the escalation now, remember when they were talking, let's provide javelin missiles. Then it was, let's provide tanks. Then it was, let's provide F-16s. Now Zelensky is demanding Tomahawk missiles. Why doesn't he just say, give me nuclear weapons? Let's just fast forward. Because let me say that no weapon, no Western weapon, no NATO weapon will be enough to defeat the Russian military. It's impossible. President of Belarus, Lukashenko, today announced that it's impossible to defeat the Russian military on the battlefield. China knows that. Russia knows that. And this war, this conflict, indeed has made Russia great again. Russia has emerged from the problems of the 1990s and the 2000s when it was heavily influenced by American agents. And unfortunately, let's just face it, unfortunately, the Soviet Union was collapsed. It wasn't the wishes of the Russian people or the Ukrainian people or the Soviet former republics. This was an operation by Western intelligence, and they celebrated at the Pentagon that day when the American advisors in Moscow instructed and influenced the leadership of the time under Gorbachev, and then after that Yeltsin, to destroy the country and hand out all of this land. Now, this land, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Ukraine, this was all earned by Russian blood. So it is a tragedy, and now it's great to see that the historical fairness has been restored in the eyes of Russian patriots and those people around the world. And I'm sure you resonate with that, George, being the leader of the Great British Workers' Party. It was, as Vladimir Putin said, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy, and it would have never have happened when the Soviet leadership could never have imagined that all of these tanks and missiles and artillery systems, which were left over in Ukraine and other countries and Moldova and East Germany and Poland, this is all built and gifted by the Soviet people. Citizens of the Soviet Union across Russia had to wait in line for cars and TVs and fridges because the country was busy subsidizing Cuba, Africa, South America, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Yugoslavia, you name it, all around the world. Russia was supporting, the Soviet Union was supporting everyone, building hydroelectric power stations and nuclear power plants. And it's a big tragedy that this has occurred, but this, of course, was not the wish of Russia. Russia never wanted, never imagined that it could fire a bullet at Ukraine, let alone a full-scale war. And it's a very clever, nasty, evil NATO operation, which has led to this tragedy. The only way this is going to stop is Russian victory. And that's what we can see. The Russian army is rolling through Donetsk towards the border with the Dnipropetrovsk region, and it looks like things are moving very quickly on the battlefield now in Russia's favor.
Indeed so, but that hasn't put NATO off confrontation in Russia's near abroad. In the last few days, their failed regime change operation in Georgia has taken a turn. They were decisively defeated at the ballot box as the OSCE, which supervised the election, observed the election with all its experts. The NATO EU putsch forces were confounded. So they're taking to the streets, Cossack. What do you know about that?
Absolutely. It's a great victory to the Georgian people. The sensible majority of Georgia has said no to NATO, no to the European Union, no to the West, and have actually defeated a well-organized infiltration campaign by Western funded and backed non-government organizations, NGOs, who are on the ground in Georgia, doing the usual color revolution, democracy, let's do little protests and hand out pamphlets and then tents and Maidans. And we know that playbook, and Russia knows that playbook. And the Georgians figured it out, that they don't want their country, Georgia, to end up like Ukraine, used and abused, chewed up and spat out by the West, by NATO. And the Georgians have said no to NATO, and it's a great thing. I congratulate the Georgian people, because being close to Russia for Georgia is an excellent thing. Georgia, as a country which borders with Russia and has a large land border, will be able to now be a hub, a facilitator of intermediate or a middleman for anti-sanction trade. So, for example, automobiles, it's an industry which is really flourishing in Georgia. Georgia buys a lot of cars, and their main export to Russia is cars, because a lot of these Western brands, for example, Japanese brands, are banned in Russia due to Western sanctions. But that's okay. Russia's turned to China, and China's providing lots of millions and millions of cars, and they've taken the chunk of the automobile industry. And it's great. And so these sanctions all work as a boomerang effect. It actually strengthens Russia, and it's better that sooner rather than later Russia abandons Western products. Russia abandons Western technology, Western software, hardware, any Western systems, microchips, anything that could make Russia reliant on the West. And this has happened over the last few years. Therefore, now in the future World War III, in a larger conflict, which is what we're heading into, clearly, I don't think anyone argues with that, disagrees with that. That world is heading into World War III. Russia is very prepared, thanks to the sanctions. So bring on the sanctions. Give us as many sanctions as you like. It only makes us stronger. It makes Russia more resilient, and only pushes Russia closer to BRICS, closer to those countries such as China, Brazil, India, who are buying more than ever Russian oil and gas, and India buying Russian oil on selling it to Europe. I mean, how silly. Russia borders with Europe. This is all about virtue signaling. Europe really doesn't want to go to with real sanctions to Russia. Handing out 10 tanks here, 20 tanks here, 30 used 50-year-old armored personnel carriers here, a few rounds here. This is all just, they're making fun of Ukraine. Right? They know they can't defeat Russia. They still trade with Russia. In fact, Russian oil is still pumped through Ukraine, and it goes through Ukraine into Europe, and the Ukrainians take a cut off the top. It's ridiculous, but that's what goes on. So this is all about virtue signaling. Australia's the same. At the Australian petrol bowsers, or the gas stations as they call them in the United States, Australian mums and dads are filling up Russian diesel into their family vehicles, into their unleaded petrol. You're receiving Russian petrol. But officially, the Australian government under Prime Minister Albanese has banned Russian oil. The oil reaches India, the oil reaches Singapore, and then mysteriously, miraculously, the oil is rechristened with new documents and declared as Singaporean oil. And the Australian side says, okay, we can buy that now. It's just definitely not Russian. Look at the documents. And the Singaporeans and the Indians make a nice 30% cut on the top, making billions of dollars, putting more pressure on families in Australia, just so the Australian Prime Minister can tell the media that he's sanctioned Russian oil. And that episode basically sums up the whole attitude of the West towards this conflict. And all I can say is we feel sorry for the Ukrainians. As a Russian patriot, as a staunch Russian, of course, I'm born in Australia, but great-grandparents from the Russian Empire, I feel sorry for the Ukrainians because they're being used. And the sooner the Russian army liberates Ukraine and kicks out all of the NATO advisors and all of these NATO instructors, infiltrators that are currently holding Ukraine to ransom, the better it will be, and peace will be restored to Ukraine. And look, let's just face it, I'd love for Ukraine just to join Russia, as with Belarus. And let's bring back, if you don't want the Soviet Union, let's bring back the Russian Empire, because whatever it's going to be, whether the Soviet Union or Russian Empire is coming back, whatever it's going to be in the next few years, something big is going to happen in Russia, and Russia is going to become great again. It already is. It's already happening. Russia's very strong. And guess who's to blame? It's NATO. So thank you, NATO.
Well, look, I can well see, as the audience will, from your knowledge and eloquence, why they want to silence you, but you will never be silenced. People can follow you on Telegram. Tell them how, please.
Look, follow me on Telegram, Aussie Cossack on Telegram, and tag Elon Musk, put up a tweet and say, bring back the Cossack hashtag. Look, I'm not an enemy of Elon Musk. I'm pretty favorable to him and Trump, because I don't want Kamala to win. So it's unusual why I was banned from Twitter. Maybe they'll restore me. But thank you very much, George, for the opportunity. And it was great to see you.
No, you took words out of my mouth. I was going to make a call to everyone watching this who has an account on X, on Twitter, to raise the demand to bring back the Cossack, because your voice was increasingly influential, which is, of course, why people tried to silence you. I myself am determined to see you back. I'm in court with Elon Musk in the next few months in my action against Twitter. I think I'll add that to my list of demands. In order to settle the case, one of the terms will be to bring back Aussie Cossack onto the Twitter. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and being so brilliantly eloquent indeed. Thank you for that. Let me go to pre-recorded third contribution from a man who has become global. When I first interviewed him some years ago, not many people, including myself, had ever heard of him. There's nobody who hasn't heard of him now. It is Professor Mohammad Marandi, the head of
successful.
The dean
It was
of
very
American Studies at the University of Tehran. Please take a listen to what he has to say.
It was very successful. The Iranian delegation was very satisfied with the results. President Pezeshkian, when he returned from the summit at the airport in Iran, he spoke in a very positive manner and said that if the decisions that were made at the summit bear fruit, then the West will no longer be able to intimidate the rest of the world. It will no longer be able to take the rest of the world hostage, and it won't be able to use sanctions to strangle people in different parts of the world in order to bully them into submission and accepting Western exceptionalism. Of course, this summit is not going to change the world overnight. This is a process, but important change is already taking place. The very fact that the Chinese and the Indians had a limited rapprochement before the summit, I think shows that both are very serious in pursuing this process, because in order for BRICS to move forward, especially with regards to new economic structures and new means of trade, these two countries have to be cooperating. So I think that rapprochement between them went very well. The Chinese president met 5 world leaders, including the president of Iran and the president of Russia. And I think that shows a great deal that is very significant under the current circumstances, when we have the war in Ukraine going on, and of course the Holocaust in Gaza and the genocidal airstrikes against the Lebanese by the Israeli regime. So bilateral ties were an important point was an important thing for Iran to pursue on the sidelines of the conference. But the conference itself, I think, showed a great deal of convergence among all countries that are members and those countries that want to join. So I'm confident that in the months ahead, we're going to see further convergence, and hopefully by next year, we're going to see a lot of developments take place, which will allow countries in the global majority, in the global south, and member states of BRICS in particular to be able to trade and do business without Western financial institutions harassing them, or the US dollar being a problem for that trade to be carried out.
Thank you, Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, the Dean of American Studies at the University of Tehran, which was an important enough job in itself, but he's since become very much more important than that. And I don't know why he was not able to appear live, but it is possible that it is in light of what must be held to be an imminent Iranian retaliation to the last Israeli attack upon Iran. Some international leaders have been calling and indeed demanding that Iran not respond to that, even though Israel has attacked Iran 3 times and Iran has retaliated only twice. The bizarre situation has arisen where the wronged country is being held to demands that it not respond. But Iran has comprehensively rejected those calls. It has reiterated over and over again that Iran has the right to defend itself. You'll remember that phraseology, and that it will indeed defend itself. And this time, in such a way and on such a scale as to establish deterrence. Because, of course, if Iran were to pull stumps 3-2 down, that would merely be to invite a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th Israeli attack upon herself. And no self-respecting country with the ability to respond would allow themselves to be in that situation. So it's my honest opinion that in the next hours, I suggest the next 24 hours maximum, Iran will launch what it says will be a devastating and extremely painful attack on Israel, far more severe than the second Iranian response. This may very well beget a 4th Israeli attack on Iran. Indeed, the Israeli cabinet has already passed a motion to do so. Irrespective of whether Iran retaliates in the next 24 hours or not, Israel has declared that it's going to attack Iran again. So the path towards the World War III that Aussie Cossack was talking about, I'm afraid is still brightly illuminated by flares and by fires, by the thunder and flash of the guns. And it's that which we in the No2Nato, No2War seek to stop. We don't glory in war. Some people say that we like war as long as it's not Western imperialist war. That's not true. I myself have been in wars. I have been bombed. I have lain with my face in the dirt, trying to press my nose into the earth, the better to avoid the red hot razor sharp steel fragments of bombs that were cascading all around me and cutting other people down, cutting other people open, killing other people. I've been under bombardment in Ethiopia. I've been under bombardment in Beirut and in the south of Lebanon. War is an utterly terrifying thing. As those who've been in it, either as soldiers or as people caught up in the crossfire, would be and should be the first to say. Our deputy leader, Andy Hudd, a leading figure in the Railwaymen's Union, ASLEF, and deputy leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, is himself a former serviceman, as many in the Workers' Party of Britain are. Even I was a boy soldier in the Royal Artillery Battery 2, based in the Scottish city of Dundee. I was fortunate enough to spend time with my fellow soldiers, their regulars, as well as reservists. We respect the armed forces. We know that we need armed forces, but we need armed forces to defend ourselves, not to be the servants of Western empire, especially when that service is actually self-harming in terms of our own national economy. So to close the meeting, I'm going to ask our comrade Andy Hudd from our veterans group in the Workers' Party to say a few words in closing. Andy, the floor is yours.
No, cheers, George. Yeah, I'm just on tonight to raise awareness and asking for people to contribute to our fundraising campaign to get a organizer for No2Nato. You would have heard the contributions tonight. That means that the need to expand on the work of No2Nato is so important now. We need a full-time organizer, and as the Aussie Cossack mentioned, you know, if we're going to get these national and international demonstrations organized, then we're going to need someone to do that. We only asked for £20,000. We need to do that, and we need to do that rapidly if we're going to be effective. The war in Ukraine is not going to go away. In relation to the veterans, the veterans organisation that we're setting up in the party, George, yeah, we've got. I'm very excited about it. We're getting a few people come to a meeting last night and make some valid contributions, and we're looking to organise veterans within the party, and we're looking to raise veterans profiles and raise veterans issues and lobby on veterans issues within the government, and attend veterans event and support our veterans. You know, as a party, we want veterans to live in the best place in the world for veteran care. You know, that's inside the services and when they come out. So that's a bit about the veterans. If you're interested, if anybody's interested in the veterans group, they can obviously join the party and join the group and become a part of that process, and hopefully will feed into the policy making processes within the party and start to make a change for veterans in the UK, George.
Thanks, Andy. As always, Andy Hudd, a great champion of the rights of veterans. We are well familiar with the sending of young men and women these days off to war with straw hats and trumpets, not so much of a welcome back home. As I once said in a celebrated debate in the Oxford Union, don't talk to me about Tommy Atkins. I've met Tommy Atkins. I've picked Tommy Atkins up off the floor in Piccadilly Gardens in the city of Manchester, hooked on spice, in and out of Strangeways prison, more likely to be found homeless than any other section of the community, more likely to be found suffering from poor mental health than any other section of the community. Our rulers don't give a toss about veterans. They don't give a toss about soldiers. They are cannon fodder for them. Well, not for us in the Workers' Party of Britain, and not for us in No2Nato, No to War. One of the reasons we don't want war is so that our service personnel are not sent to their death or dismemberment in the interests of a dementia patient called Joseph Biden, whose last days are almost upon us. I don't speak for everybody when I say this, but I definitely speak for me. However you vote on the 5th of November in the United States of America, don't vote for Kamala Harris. It's been marvelous for me. I hope you enjoyed the meeting. We have kept it more or less to the hour. If you want to join us, follow us on our social media portals. If you want to help us, donate anything, however small. On the screen, you saw the QR code. Donate to the £20,000 appeal to create the position of full-time organizer of No to NATO, No to War. It's been marvelous talking with you. I hope you found it an interesting meeting. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.